Good evening and welcome to the January 9th, 2023 meeting of the Planning Board of the Town of Chatham. My name is Catherine Halpern. I'm Chair of the Planning Board for the Town of Chatham. And this meeting is being conducted in a hybrid format. I will give you a few points on that in just a few moments. And please also note that this meeting is being recorded and will be available shortly hereafter for scheduled and on-demand viewing on any smartphone or tablet device. Also, I just need to ask if anyone else is recording the meeting. Please notify the chair. If you're connected remotely, I'll give you a few seconds in case you're muted. All right, no one's recording, but that's all right. So this meeting of the Chatham Planning Board is being conducted both in person and via remote participation in accordance with Section 20 of Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021 and shall afford adequate alternative means of public access via Microsoft Teams or by calling the phone number 1-508-945-4410. That's 1-508-945-4410. And the conference ID number is 485-839-958#. That's 485-839-958#. Or as I mentioned, you can join the meeting online using Microsoft Teams through the link that is in the agenda posted on the town website. Despite our best efforts, we may not be able to provide for real-time access, and as I mentioned, we'll post a record of this meeting on the town's website as soon as possible. And in accordance with town policy, the public can speak to any issue or business item on the agenda during the meeting when recognized by the chair, and we will allow time for that after board discussion. So the first item on our agenda is we would like to welcome new members of the Chatham Planning Board. Very happy to welcome them. Megan Story and Charlene Greenhalgh, did I pronounce? Greenhalgh. My apologies. Charlene has had some 35 years experience as a professional planner. She is a long-term resident of Chatham. She first came to Chatham in 1987 to work as the assistant town planner, and then she moved permanently to Chatham in 1990. And Charlene spent the next 30 years in various planning and assistant town administrator positions before retiring in 2020. She's also a member of the Home Consortium Advisor Board and consultant occasionally. We're very happy to have Charlene as a member of this board. The professional experience that you bring to the board is going to be invaluable. And we know you're also very familiar with Cape issues and Chatham issues, so it's a great plus. Also, we're very happy to welcome Megan Story to the planning board. Megan is a professional marketing executive. She also has a background in commercial real estate, and she also has recently had experience as a member of our Zoning Board of Appeals and is also a long-term resident of Chatham, very familiar with Chatham and Chatham issues, and a very strong professional background bringing to the board. And again, we'd like to welcome Megan to the board. And thank you for joining our already very strong team. I have to say every member of this board is very well qualified, and we also have excellent team on our staff with Ryan and Katie and everyone in the community development department. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Charlene and Megan, for joining us. Okay. So next item on the agenda is the minutes from December 12th. If I could ask if any board member has any corrections, additions, amendments to the minutes from the December 12th meeting. If there are none, may I have a motion to approve the minutes for December 12th? May I have a second?
Warren Chain, so moved.
All right, we'll do a roll call vote. Bob Wirtschafter?
Bob Wirtschafter, approve.
Art Sprue?
Art Sprue, approve.
Warren Chain?
Warren Chain, approve.
Now, Megan and Charlene, you weren't here, so you'll abstain, and Bob Dubus?
Bob Dubus, approve.
And this is Catherine Halpern. I also approve the minutes from December 12th. Thank you. Next item on our agenda, we'll be doing our regular business first. I should have mentioned at the outset of the meeting Normally, we do our long-range planning discussion first and then regular business. This evening, we'll do our regular business first. We'll start with the formal site plan review for 1223 Main Street, and this is a change of use, an amendment to the site plan. And we have Bill Litchfield presenting.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, members of the board. Want to echo what the chair said about welcoming your two members. I'm confused as to what day it is because I usually see Ms. Story on Thursdays rather than Mondays. You're in the same seat. It's particularly useful to have a representative of a far-off land that begins with 432 on this board. There's been some suggestion that South Chatham is not always as well represented as it might be. Charlene, I have known for longer than either she or I would want to talk about, but it's nice to have her. And it's particularly useful to see Ryan back here. It's old home week in a number of ways, so I will try to be brief. With me today is Tom Guadagno, who is doing business or proposes to do business as Liberty Artisanal Breads. The existing hair salon at 1223 Main Street will be replaced by Tom's Retail Bakery. I provided you with a narrative, which I will paraphrase because it raises a couple of points, one or two of which have changed since the pre-application conference. While this is a change of use category, it's not really a change of use. It's going from personal and household services to retail, but the parking calculation remains the same. The building consists of 3 commercial units with 3 apartments upstairs, has at present 24 parking spaces with considerable room in the rear for overflow parking, and there's some parking that exists out there now, apparently. And there is room for locating a trash disposal facility at the rear, as we've shown on the notation on the plan. The building itself is about the unit itself is about 1,200 square feet, but a much smaller portion will be used just the front for retail space. The total number of employees will be somewhere between 4 and 6, never, however, with more than 4 on site at any one time. The bakery itself, the area for customer use, and we don't want to double count it between the seating use and the retail use, seating for 8 to 10 spaces, and with employee spaces will probably only require at a maximum 6 spaces, perhaps less than that, parking spaces. We had originally mentioned parking outside, or rather seating outside. We're not proposing to do that. If it ever becomes something that Tom would like to do, we will come back to you for a change of use, or at least consult with staff. This is a modification of existing use and is in the staff report, which Ryan prepared, and we thought she did a very good job in doing so. Many aspects of the criteria set forth in the bylaw are not applicable. No change in vehicular pedestrian traffic, stormwater, and drainage facilities were approved in the prior site plan. And I note from the staff report that I believe Ryan has given you copies of that original drainage plan. So based on the questions and comments that we heard at the pre-application, parking certainly was an issue. As you know, the bylaw provides that parking requirements are designed to address parking demand created by a change of use, creating higher parking demands. This does not create any higher parking demand. The requirements for personal and household services and retail use are the same, 1 space per 150 square feet of customer area. I went back and looked at your files on this property, and there's a prior, interestingly enough, a prior change of use allowing for a bakery on site. So it's another example of coming back to the future here. But at the time, the Department of Community Development, the then director, noted that there's no history of parking concerns or congestion at the property, and that remains true today. We recognize, of course, that you have an interest in potential needs for other uses on the location. There are 3 commercial units. 1 is vacant. The dog grooming business appears to have approximately 300 square feet of retail/customer use, which requires 2 spaces. Even if we add some additional extra parking spaces for the other 2 units, We have, at the most, 22 which are required. That includes 6 spaces assigned to the tenants upstairs. So that's not going to be an issue because we have 24 spaces. And as indicated in the narrative, and as I said earlier, there is the potential for overflow parking at the rear. You did ask at the pre-application conference about venting of the ovens. These will be electric, not gas ovens. Tom is working with the vendors for that and for the installer, and will consult with the health agent in the building department for appropriate venting, so we don't think that's going to be an issue. There are no exterior changes, but we acknowledge that you inquired about what appears to be a slowly sinking storm drain in the front parking lot. We brought that to the attention of the property owner, and we feel that given that there is not a problem with drainage and has not been a problem with drainage, that's not an issue. Parenthetically, Tom was on site during 2 fairly heavy recent rains, found no drainage or flooding problems. So we are before you today to answer any other questions that you have. I know you've read Ryan's staff report, and I really defer to that for what we're seeking. Be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. So this is a formal site plan review, and we'll be voting to approve it or not to approve it, but generally we are going to be voting to approve it with conditions, just to remind you. So we do just need to make sure that all of our site plan criteria are fulfilled. So I'll go through board members and see if you have any comments or questions. And Arthur, I'll start with you. Arthur was provided with the detailed drainage report and stormwater report. So please let us know, Arthur, if you have any questions.
Just a couple of clarifications. The plan that was provided that's dated from, it's got several revisions on it, but it's, I think it's June of '92. It shows both the calculations on the plan, which it's an excellent plan, and it shows 4 catch basins out in the 2 front parking lots and 1 in the rear, and it shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 infiltration galleys. There are only 2 catch basins out in the parking lot, none in the back, and no evidence of any of the infiltration basins. So is there a subsequent plan after this one that altered this, because this was the last one that was approved? Or is there an as-built plan that verifies that this plan was actually built? Because I didn't see any evidence of it out there on site.
I believe this was the most recent up-to-date plan that we were able to find. I don't believe that there was an as-built, though we can certainly, do a little bit more digging. But after going through the files, we saw that this was the plan that was approved, I believe, the last plan that we were aware of.
We ran into this before at a couple other sites where there was an approved plan and then it wasn't built that way. And this dates back, multiple decades. And now all of a sudden, when we get something like this in front of us, and we take a look at what was approved, and it's not built that way, I think that's a problem. This is getting to be a repeat of every time we see a reuse, a refiling, and we take a look at the information of what was supposed to be built and that wasn't built that way. I'd like to see what the other board members have to say, but somehow, some way, this needs to be rectified.
Could I try to respond to this?
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Litchfield.
And Megan can speak to this. Because she's heard it at the Board of Appeals, and I think that our incumbent Director of Community Development can as well. When you go to the Zoning Board of Appeals to get a special permit to do something, for that matter, when you build a house, you have to later file a plot plan, a certified plot plan from an engineer saying, this is what was approved, this is what was built. They have to be the same. That might be something for the planning board to consider in the future. Have a means to have property owners, which parenthetically Tom is not, come back. All we're seeking to do is operate a bakery, so we don't have any authority over the parking lot. But that might be a means of solving the problem to the degree that there is a problem. As for this location, however, I don't have any information as to whether the drainage was installed as designed or proposed to be designed. I do have knowledge from Tom and from having driven by it over the last 30 years that it seems to work without a problem.
Yeah. If I could just make a comment, I mean, to the best of my understanding, the same thing holds true for site plan approvals given by the planning board, that in order to issue the certificate of occupancy or the building permit, that the requirements need to be fulfilled, and that the building commissioner does inspect them. Isn't that correct? So I think it's the
building
same.
commissioner would not necessarily inspect the drainage. What typically happens and what this board does now, and maybe this is the corrective action, was this board now requires that an as-built be
Yes.
provided. But again, where this plan was presented a number of years ago, that may not have been the practice at that time.
Correct. Mhm.
This board
Yes.
does require that now, and that may have been the problem. But we can
Yes.
certainly look into this. Again, this is, an issue that we would work with the property owner.
Yes, yeah. Yes, no, I think that's right. I think in the past, it wasn't required. It is required now. The planning board does require an as-built plan to be filed. And also, for that reason, I mentioned to Katie and Ryan earlier today that a few years ago, the planning board decided that whenever anything comes before us, for whatever reason, we do a full review, and we make sure that all of the requirements are met. And especially in some of these older properties where the plans date some decades ago, there are things missing. And so when it comes before us, we do ask that everything is brought up to date according to current standards. But Katie's right, in this case, it does seem to be the responsibility of the property, the drainage situation would be the responsibility of the property owner, because we understand that this space is being leased for the
Correct.
bakery. Yeah, so that would be more fair and a more fair and correct way of approaching it. Arthur, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with you that some aspects of it, I guess I'm perplexed to continually see this when we see these reuses being applied to our board. And once we look into what was supposed to be built, is not built, and then we end up, as a community, dealing with the consequences of that. This site is not going to be a burden onto any drainage going onto to Route 28. That's a positive. However, it's not mitigating what impervious runoff was originally designed for. When you're talking about 5 infiltration galleys and I see 0 on site, there's supposed to be 5 catch basins, there's 2 on site. That tells me that something significant wasn't done. It's one thing that if they had done something at the major part of the parking lot and maybe the catch basin on the rear was eliminated, that's a little different. But the whole front parking lot takes the drainage from the buildings as well as all the parking lot. And I have no idea whether the system out there, which is a single catch basin on either end, I don't know what kind of infiltration system is associated with it, mimics anything that was approved back in 1992. I think somehow, some way, the property owner has to come back before us and give us some information and evidence about what happened here and how that can be corrected or rectified.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what we were looking at when we looked at Dogfish Taco on Chippehoy, that
Yeah.
there were issues.
Right.
There were issues with the parking, but it wasn't specifically to do with that tenant. It was to do with the whole property. But as part of the approval for Dogfish Taco to be installed, to start there, we did have to meet with the owner, and he did have to give us a revised parking plan where the new curb cuts would be with the roundabout and so on. So we do need to mitigate this in some way. Yes, Mr.
If I
Litchfield.
can make one
you-
brief suggestion,
yes.
because I don't want to get bogged down on the drainage issue over which we have no control. As of today, the left-hand unit is still vacant, correct? The one closest to town. There may be an occasion for a new use going in there, and perhaps that might be an opportunity to address it with the property owner. we have no authority, no jurisdiction, no knowledge. But I would suspect that Ryan and Katie could contact the property owner if need be prior to any change of use for that unit and say that this might be addressed.
Katie, do you have a suggestion how to best handle this?
No, I agree with Attorney Litchfield. That's something that we can certainly do. I also wanted to mention, or just a question for Art, this property was actually subdivided, and I'm not, I'm just curious from, from what you're looking at, 2 of the catch basins would have been on, in front of the building, opposite the shared driveway?
There's
Or did you-
there's 2 catch basins that are, if you're taking a look from the street side toward the buildings, there's 2 catch basins that are supposed to be on the right parking lot and 2 catch basins on the left parking lot. And also, there's supposed to be 2 infiltration galleys on the right parking lot, 2 infiltration galleys on the left parking lot. So none of that is of evidence. The details here on this show that all of those structures are supposed to have a casting at the surface. The only thing that's at the surface are 3 castings. There's 1 for the catch basin in each of the parking lot, that's 2, and then there's a sanitary manhole casting. I'm assuming that that's because the Title V system has been replaced with a sewer, and that's been connected to the town sewer system, and that system is no longer in use. But doesn't seem like there's any evidence of the infiltration galleys at all, which should have structures to the surface so they could be cleaned and inspected. So nothing was built. My observation says it wasn't built according to this plan that was approved. I mean, it's one thing that a few things are altered, but a huge amount of what this plan is showing from the calculations that needed to be done to mitigate the stormwater was never built. That to me means that something happened and between 92 and today, and it's being picked up right now because we're observing that. We're trying to take a look at all site plans to make sure that they're complying with at least some aspect of stormwater.
Sure. Thank you, I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure, because as I said, the property had been subdivided, and
Yep.
buildings 1 and 2 are now under separate ownership. I just wanted
Okay.
to make sure that we were looking at the site as a whole.
If we take a look at this and split the property in half, each of them are not in compliance with this approved plan.
So Katie, that means the ownership is different currently than it was in 92, and there are 2 owners now, whereas in 92 presumably it was 1. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Madam
So,
Chairman,
yes,
may I speak to Arthur?
you
Yeah.
may.
Yep,
Arthur, I know the structures are there.
yeah,
They just were paved over,
yeah.
okay?
Well, that would be good to know.
You know how I know?
Yeah,
Did you do it?
Our company did it.
Yeah, okay,
And the
okay,
person that built it, his uncle was an engineer and engineered everything and determined that they didn't need 4 catch basins, 2 would suffice.
I would agree with you on that part, yeah,
And yeah, they didn't get a plan,
okay.
so, but I know the structures are there.
I will then defer to your information there and actually back off of any pursuit of this. I mean, if you can confirm that, that's better
I
to
can
me
confirm it,
than
and I will,
anything else that I've seen or heard so far on that.
But because
Hands on.
if they weren't there,
Yeah.
the parking lot would have flooded.
I would agree with you
Immense.
completely. It would shock the heck out of me of how much impervious area that's out there, and it's no flooding with just a single catch basin.
Right. But anyway, I know they're there.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so Arthur, are you satisfied? We need no
That's it.
further action on this. Is that okay?
I'm good. Thank
Okay,
you.
great, great.
Thanks for
All
your
right.
patience with me.
Yes, great. Great, and so Warren, comments, questions?
Madam Chairman,
Just
I
couple
have a
of,
question.
Minor ones compared to catch basins.
Okay, go ahead.
The discussion we had last week is now reflected on here as to where a dumpster can be sited.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, I'm assuming, not assuming anything, I would ask the question, is the dumpster meant to service all 3 businesses as
No.
well as 3 apartments?
Not unless there's some contribution from those parties, no.
No, that would be my assumption. So the dumpster that is shown on the plan would just be for the bakery.
Yes, and that's just an approximate location you have in your file. A letter from the property owner saying that it would be sort of a cooperative endeavor of his choice and the hauler's choice as well as Tom's. But that's the logical place to put it.
Yeah, and it's gravel underneath it at this point, the surface,
And he
correct?
did not want a pad, that was in his letter, did not want a
Okay.
concrete pad.
And is it assumed that it would
Parenthetically,
just be a
Tom's breads are
dumpster?
very light, so we won't need a pad.
Would it just be sitting out on the gravel, or is it envisioned that it have a screen around it?
In that location, I'm not sure there's a requirement for a screen. It's not visible from any way.
No, I agree. Just wanted to clarify what is being talked about. There's an awful lot of trash cans around that are out there, but they belong to recently the apartments and so on. And, you know, at some point, it becomes an eyesore, I guess. But I just wanted to clarify what I assumed would be the case here, that there's no pad and that it would just be the location of a dumpster. It could be moved around, really, because there's plenty of room back there, depending on what's easy. Okay, the second point I wanted to have was we talked a little bit at last time, I believe, about having some assigned parking spaces for the 3 apartments. There ought to be 6 parking spaces, and would there be an objection to having those assigned spaces put as, you know, a requirement with appropriate signage such that there would be no issues with parking for the tenants? And for me, it seems that it's likely that there's likely to be more traffic, visitors, customers, once the bakery takes off, and it's appropriate that the tenants have a place to park without having necessarily to park in an inconvenient place. Part of the question I have was, again, where would that be? In the front, which is one whole story. I don't know where the entrance to all the apartments are. I believe it's in the front, but I'm not sure of that. And I'm not sure whether it wouldn't be better for the tenants to have the parking spaces in the rear. But whichever is most convenient is what I think I would like to see conditioned.
If I could respond.
Yes, please go ahead, Mr.
Fortunately or unfortunately, that's something over which we have absolutely no control or say or authority. I can observe that I don't know who is living in the apartments. It may be people who only have 1 car, so assigning 6 spaces for 3 cars might not be appropriate, or there could be, I suppose, 3 people in each apartment, each with a car. But we have no ability or right to speak to that. Remember, we're leasing the interior
No.
space for a
Yeah.
bakery, so that's kind of beyond that, beyond anything that we could have anything to say about.
Yeah.
No, I do understand the point, but I just wanted to make my feeling, you know, known that I think that is appropriate. And granted, there's nothing you or your client can do about it, but no other comments.
Yes, yeah, I think, again, that's correct. That would be the responsibility of the owner of the property to designate the apartment parking space.
Madam Chairman,
Yes. Go
the
ahead,
apartments
Mr.
have been there
Dubus.
for a long time, and
Yes.
people seem to find their own and have their own parking place.
Yeah,
So I don't, with the stores coming and going, they still have their own parking places. I don't think that anybody's ever complained about somebody being in their parking place.
yeah,
No matter where, we don't know where they are, but they are there.
yeah. Good. Did you have another comment, Mr. Dubus, before I go
I
on?
did.
Megan and Charlene?
I want to go off the grid a minute.
Okay.
Do you make donuts? You don't.
No.
Because we have a severe shortage in this town of donuts, just so you know. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
I think Mr. Guadagno would be more likely to do beignets than donuts, but
Yes.
we could talk about that later.
Sounds good. Megan, comments, questions?
None, although I would like to reiterate what Mr. Dubus was saying about the parking being, I can't speak to whether or not it's an issue, but I do think that all tenants in a commercially zoned building, if you live in the residential piece, you know what you're getting into when you move into an apartment like that. So I don't think that it would fall under us to sort of mitigate where those people park. Other than that, I have no questions.
Okay, great. Charlene?
Thank you. First of all, staff, thank you for a very thorough staff report. I know how they can be difficult at times. I agree with my counterparts here in that if the folks who are renting the apartments, if they have an issue, they're going to go to their landlord and demand that they have assigned parking. The building's been there for 30 years. I don't believe that there have been any issues. Other than that, I really have no questions or comments.
Okay. Bob Dubus, any other comments, or have you
Oh, I'm
made your
happy.
Okay. And Bob Wertschafter?
Oh, I have nothing.
Okay. The only concerns I had that the board brought up at your pre-application were the trash, the drainage, and the parking, and I think we've adequately covered all of those issues.
Thank you.
And that you meet all the requirements. So that being said, I would ask for a motion to approve this site plan.
Bob Dubus will make a motion to approve the site plan.
And do I have a second to that motion?
Charlene Greenhalgh, seconds.
Thank you. Bob Wertschafter, how do you vote?
I approve.
Arthur?
Art Spur, approve.
Warren Chain?
Warren Chain, approve.
Megan Story?
Megan Story, approve.
Charlene?
Charlene Greenhalgh, approve.
Bob?
Bob Dubus, approve.
And this is Catherine Halpern. I also approve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And we wish you great success in your business.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Dubus maybe set a precedent by suggesting it be possible to go off the grid. I see that Mr. Guadagno has something here.
Yes,
As
we
I won't
noticed.
say promise, because that would be inappropriate, but as he said he might bring when we came back. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming before us. And again, we do wish you great success in your business. Great. We could wait till we take a little break. Yeah. Can you leave them for us? Is that all right? All right. Thank you so much, and we can return the plate to you.
If you want, it's vegan without the butter. With
Okay.
the butter, it's
Oh, great. That's good to
a little
know.
extra delicious.
Yes. Thank you so much.
I appreciate everyone's really thoughtful comments. I agree with a lot of things.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Great.
Just
Well, thank you for going through the process.
Kath, we're watching you.
When can we expect you to be open?
Well, when it gets built out and I've got people ready to serve the public. I hope by the beginning of the summer, that's my.
What do you mean, we're hoping for next week? What are you talking about here? Come on.
You know,
I'm
this,
aim for spring and see what happens.
the season really starts in April now. You know?
I agree. Actually, I will bake at home
Oh,
early
great.
and try to make it get to part of the Chatham Farmers Market to
Great.
use my business.
Great.
So people
Great.
can start then.
Good luck. Yeah. Thank you.
And I'll pick it up tomorrow or whenever.
Great. Okay. So I think we could just continue right now and take a break a little later since it's only 4:30. And move on to our long-range planning discussion. And we're going to continue the discussion tonight of the West Chatham Neighborhood Center proposed draft zoning bylaw amendment. And maybe I'll just make a few comments, and I may ask Katie and Ryan also to make a few comments. But where we ended at our last meeting, December 12th, we basically went through the rest of the draft bylaw that was prepared by, together with, I should say, the Cape Cod Commission, and there were certain open issues, and in a very efficient manner, the board considered all those open issues, and I believe we voted on them, and we basically made some decisions on those open issues. And we also reviewed the revised draft language for the footnotes that have to deal with the runway protection zone that were revised with the advice of town council, and I think the board agreed that those were acceptable. What we don't have is, due to a technical situation, or maybe Katie, you'd like to explain what
Sure.
the situation is, yeah.
Sure, and I can let Ryan jump in as well.
Sure.
But just to, back on December 12th, there was a topic of conversation regarding the density regarding affordable or attainable dwelling units. And I believe at that meeting, I went back and watched the tape today just
Oh,
to be
great.
sure. There was a request for us to revise some language regarding the affordable and attainable and the density, and maybe perhaps looking at whether or not we could do a percentage of the number of units required would be, something that we would like to include into the draft. Upon further conversation with staff, we feel that that's a much larger discussion on the way we were looking at potentially drafting some language, and we would feel that we will need to involve both Gloria, Town Council, and perhaps DHCD as we look at drafting that language. So again, we do
Yes.
not have anything for you this evening, and it would probably be at least a few weeks before we would be able to present something to the board regarding, specifically regarding the conversation that we had at the last meeting.
Yes, the one open issue that's not resolved. And that would that include language that might require year-round versus?
Yes.
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 Yes, so that's the one open issue that's not resolved. That would take some time for staff to add that language to the bylaw. So I'll cut to the chase. I think the decision the board needs to make that I'd like to ask you tonight is if we want to include that language, and I'll ask Ryan to go over the schedule, but it will probably mean that we won't be able to introduce this to annual town meeting 2023. So I think in a nutshell, that's the situation. If we didn't feel that we wanted to include that language, staff could present to us the draft with all of the decisions that were made at the last meeting integrated, and could present a final draft to us on January 23rd. And then if we vote and accept that draft, we could presumably put this on annual town meeting 2023, provided that the board was also comfortable with doing a lot of the community outreach in the context of the public hearing schedule, which we've already done quite a bit, many years of community outreach on these issues. So my personal opinion is that would be acceptable. But if we do want to include this language and research it, that will take some time. Ryan, did you want to add some?
Sure,
points
just
to
a
that?
comment. I mean, if it feels like it's a loss not having that language in this version going forward, I would say that there's an opportunity, and perhaps a more suitable approach would be to include that language in an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which there has been some discussion of preparing at the staff level and for review with the board over the course of the next year. So that language can be preserved townwide in a separate effort, rather than trying to spearhead it here and lose the momentum that you have in bringing all of the public discussion and amendments to this ordinance. So if you do want to separate that affordability and attainability discussion out and go with what was originally presented and the amendments as discussed, which staff have been tracking, and as of to date, I now have an editable version that I can incorporate all of those revisions and present to you at your next meeting on the 23rd, at which time, if you made a recommendation, if you were comfortable moving forward and made a recommendation to the select board, you could initiate the public hearing process and have a public hearing in advance of the May town meeting.
Okay, and then the inclusionary bylaw would apply to West Chatham as well.
I think
Yes.
we can craft it however is appropriate, but inclusionary ordinances tend to be a more suitable place to talk about units and relative to certain zones and percent requirements and other incentives such as monies available through the trust. You know, you can package all of that in one inclusionary ordinance rather than trying to just tuck it in here. And then it would ultimately apply in the future to this zone.
All right. Katie, any other comments from your side? And then we'll open up to board discussion.
Sure, the other item that the board should consider tonight is whether or not they would like to have, to send the draft RPZ footnote language to the Airport Commission, or if they'd like to have potentially a joint meeting with the Airport Commission to discuss. So again, that language, we could incorporate into the draft, but there could be some recommended changes from the Airport Commission as well. There very well may not be, but it's just something that the board should consider. So I think, as Ryan was saying, we could potentially get something before town meeting, but the board needs to make those decisions about whether or not we're comfortable with the language that we have moving forward, and the board would see a final draft of the overall bylaw for their January 23rd meeting.
Okay, great. So let's just have discussion, comments at first about the two open issues that have been presented, one being the language regarding affordable, attainable, and so on, whether or not we feel we must include it in West Chatham, or whether you're comfortable doing it as a separate inclusionary ordinance that will later apply. And then also just the issue of the draft language for the RPZ footnotes, whether we should have a joint meeting with the Airport Commission, or whether we could send them the copy and ask them for their comments. Arthur, comments, discussion?
Well, I'm interested in moving the bylaw forward in this Maytown meeting, and I understand about the affordable and attainable housing piece. It seems like it's something that shouldn't be just reserved for the West Chatham Neighborhood Center. And so it makes more sense than, if we're looking for this from a townwide perspective, then the inclusionary bylaw may be the better way to go. If that's the case, then there would be no reason to pull this back for a whole year, because we could do that in parallel over the next year, and that could accomplish something beyond just the neighborhood center. I'm not sure a one-year delay in this item alone would warrant us for holding the whole article, whole bylaw back for a whole year. We've come a long way on this. I think the next part, which is this footnote, I looked at the revised language from the January 4th memo from you, Ryan and Katie. I think it addresses everything that we talked about at the last meeting. I think we're good to go to actually forward this to the Airport Commission, ask for their input. If the board wants to meet with them, a joint meeting, that's fine with me. But if they sign off on this without any major issues or pushback, then perhaps we can go ahead with it as it is. But this at least is the direction on the footnote. What we had fleshed out over multiple times, multiple iterations, and I think it gets to where at least I think we should be with this, and how we should address this is today, as best we can.
Great, okay. So I'm going to take from you that you are in favor of moving forward and deferring the added language to the,
Yes.
yes, and forwarding the footnotes to the Airport Commission rather than asking for a joint meeting at this point. Yeah, I'm actually in agreement with that too. Katie, did you have a comment?
Sure, Madam Chair, thank you. I would just ask that as the board members are talking and giving their thoughts on how we're moving forward, I think we want to resolve the density question. And so the
Okay.
question was, what would the density be for that original language that we have in there was that it would be 8 units per acre with 12 with the
yes.
affordability,
Yes.
with 2 affordable units required. So if that language is sufficient to move forward, that would
Yes.
be,
I-
just ask that the board members opine on that as well.
Okay, great. I had understood that we did confirmed that last time, but perhaps I was in error. Yeah.
I agree. I thought we had confirmed that too. At least myself, I will confirm that I was comfortable with the 8 and 12.
Yeah. Yes. Great. Warren?
Yes, my principal area of interest is the density questions. I too do not want to cause this to not get to town meeting in May. I think it's important that we do it, given the progress we've made. The clarity that we had on discussion of density at our last meeting is a bit illusory to me. So, it's important to me that I understand generally the sense of the board. I've gone through and done a bunch of markups on the draft, but with respect to density, based on everything I've heard and my becoming ever more comfortable with what I think makes sense here, I think, point one, it's very important that we should have a minimum density as well as a maximum density. Otherwise, we're going to end up with one single-family home, or it can't be, but it's going to be one large structure as opposed to people putting in as many as possible. That's my observation as to what's physically happening in town. And I also not sure I understand why we can't actually say what we want to accomplish in the neighborhood centers with respect to affordable, attainable housing. I don't want to slow things down, but if we know what we want to say, I'm not sure why we can't find the words to say it quickly. I don't think it in any way affects wording in other zoning areas in town. There's very little in our zoning bylaw which is relevant to other areas of town. I'll perhaps just read what I think ought to be in the section, which wouldn't be maximum density, it would just be density. It says all zones, the minimum 8 dwelling units, maximum 12 dwelling units per acre, of which 25% must be affordable or attainable, and no payment in lieu of wording should be incorporated in there such that you've got to build them. You can't just make a payment to a trust. So that no payment in lieu of affordable or attaining housing units ought to be incorporated. Perhaps not in the density piece, but it goes hand in hand with it. I have a large number of other edits, whatever. But I don't want to take up the time at the moment with everybody. I should perhaps at least signal that as a result of being on the short-term rental committee, another aspect of this has at least come into focus in my review of this draft. And that is that while we would not envision that the housing units in the neighborhood center necessarily be short-term rentals, if they're privately owned, we certainly shouldn't be restricting that. But there is a small and perhaps growing or potentially growing issue with respect to residences being taken up and operated either by corporate entities or other devices by which they become a business of providing event venues. That is certainly not the intent that we have event venues popping up in the neighborhood center. So I think it's appropriate, given that we're drafting with out of whole cloth here what the bylaws ought to say, we ought to ensure that short-term rentals, at least for the affordable and attainable housing, utilization of the event of the attainable affordable housing units cannot be used as short-term rental units. And I think that the board needs to be thinking in terms of if there, how we could ensure that all housing units really are not going to be put up as short-term housing units. So all we're doing is creating more vacation places for the general public and really not achieving the objective of trying to create year-round residences or housing for people wishing to downsize or to merely be in a zone where they can walk to whatever they need. Those are my key questions, so I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay, yeah, Ryan,
Can I make just a response
Please.
to that?
Yes, please
So through the permanent deed restriction on any affordable or attainable unit, there will be a year-round resident requirement, whether it's a DHCD restriction or some other form that we adopt locally for attainable units that exceed DHD thresholds. But that deed restriction is the mechanism to prevent those units from becoming short-term rentals. They would be required to be year-round. So I don't think you have to prescribe it here in the zoning.
Well, again, I've never seen exactly what defines in zoning the short attainable or affordable. But I'm assuming the whole discussion is open as to what those wordings ought to be, not only here, but in other zoning. I just wanted to make sure that we don't end up with a zoning bylaw for the neighborhood center, which somehow or other can be misused in terms to our intent, which I think is quite clear.
And I think that as a separate initiative, staff can bring forward, if the board is interested, some recommendations about how other communities are responding to short-term rentals. It's been a very hot-button issue across the region, and there are some evolving strategies that communities are taking that are reasonable regulations, and we could take that up as a separate discussion item with you at a certain future date if you'd like.
okay.
Thank you.
But your point generally is that it's not the most effective approach to include it in the zoning bylaw for West Chatham. It's better addressed through other mechanisms. Is that what you're saying?
To retain any units created as year-round rentals, the deed restriction for those affordables will guarantee that that is the outcome for that unit.
Can I get,
Bob Wirtschafter.
is there any reason why it has to be limited to the affordable? I think what Warren was suggesting is that every unit in that area, in this zone, should be,
Year-round.
have that same deed restriction, so.
That's where it gets a little trickier for us to regulate year-round requirements.
I mean, there are deed restrictions on over 50 and all kinds of, why can't we have that deed restriction built into this area in general?
See, well, Bob, the committee doesn't have any authority to make decisions, only recommendations. The short-term rental committee, of which I was designated the planning board member, would certainly be taking under advisement how you perhaps can regulate, not via bylaw, but regulate the short-term rental industry in Chatham, which would include, I certainly would want it to include all of the housing that is in the neighborhood centers. But it is a little difficult to prohibit short-term rentals by a property owner when in fact there are 1,300 properties in Chatham already used for short-term rentals. I'm less concerned with trying to deal with the legal niceties of restricting property owners' rights with respect to renting their property than I am with ensuring that we don't have short-term rentals being essentially event venues as opposed to residences. And certainly even more concerned that to the extent we create any affordable, attainable housing, that it not end up being that our intent not be eliminated by whatever mechanism is possible, that they shouldn't be allowed to be used for event venues. They shouldn't also be available for other unintended uses. But in fact, merely having whatever regulations are promulgated by the town regarding short-term rentals, I certainly am in favor of them applying equally well to West Chatham neighborhood or the other neighborhood centers as any other parts of town, be they in the commercial, housing that's either in the commercial or residential zones.
Yeah, if we're giving the go-ahead for 8 units per acre or whatever, I think that's a sort of a gift that we're giving that has to have a restriction, that we're giving those densities because we're looking for full-time, long-term occupation, and therefore that needs to be part of the agreement in terms of, yeah, we'll let you build at 8 or 12, but it's not to build 8 or 12 rental properties that are short-term rental properties. And that's what I frankly think that we're going to have some issues with the town if we say we're going to let this area have 8 or 12 units per acre and without any restrictions, and so we could have 250 rental units, short-term rental units on the job lot in 5-10 years. Somebody's going to bring that up. And we need to have more than, we're going to do some other things down the road to make sure that doesn't happen.
Well, Bob, I would,
Hi.
Excuse me, I think Megan would like to speak.
So I think that it wasn't mentioned in my bio, but it is of note that I am on the Affordable Housing Trust as well. And when you build, and I have significant experience in sort of researching and awareness of affordable housing, and when you build affordable or attainable housing, as you need to be designated by the state to do so, you cannot, the deed restriction exists. So there will be no short-term rentals. You cannot sublet your affordable housing. So that just, it is what it is. If you're giving that, if it's 8 or 10, or I didn't write it down and I should know because I was on zoning, but to be it. It will be affordable, it will be attainable, depending on how that's defined. But both of those designations require the deed restriction that you cannot sublet your affordable housing.
Yeah, but we're not
We're not-
requiring that every unit that gets built in that 8 per acre be attainable or affordable, and that's the problem. I would rather say they all have to be attainable or affordable so that we can put that deed restriction on them, rather than have some that could be built that would then become.
So essentially, we're looking at it as like a 40B situation?
No,
I mean, I think.
not at all.
To
Yeah, I'm
your point,
confused,
your concern is with the market rate units that we would be allowing under the higher density.
Yeah.
And how to regulate those market rate units so they don't become short-term rentals. And I would suggest that there's an alternate way to do that. I think there are rental registration.
Oh,
Sorry.
you might,
Start back.
yeah, I'm going to
So-
ask you to start at the beginning, yeah.
So your concern that I'm hearing is that your issue is with how to regulate the market rate units that would be permitted under the higher density so that they don't become short-term rental properties. And I think that there is an alternate way to do that, rather than looking at deed restrictions, which we really, I don't think have any ability to enforce outside of a DHCD state authorized process. I think that there are ways to regulate short-term rentals through rental registration programs and nuisance zoning bylaws, and that's how most communities are starting to respond to the issue of short-term rentals sort of being on steroids lately. I mean, the vacation rental market is something that the Cape has long had as part of its history. I mean, there are people that, move into Nickerson State Park a couple weeks out of the summer just so they can pay their taxes. So we, finding that balance is important, but I think there's other ways to do it than through this zoning.
Yeah. Yes, Charlene.
I think an easier way to accomplish, and I certainly hear what Bob W., that's how I'm going to refer to you guys, because I think it's easier for me. I agree with his concern. Would we not be able to just simply say that the purpose and intent of the units that are being created, they are for year-round housing, period? Whether it's affordable or attainable or market rate, that it is, have it in the zoning bylaw that it is for and intended, and the purpose is for year-round rental. Because I agree, you can't do a deed restriction on a non-attainable or a non-affordable unit. It's just, there's no mechanism that I'm aware of that exists for that. But simply putting it in the bylaw, if they're in violation of zoning, you know, hey, you're in violation of zoning, you need to rectify it.
But wouldn't this be the language that would need to be researched? And so it can be put in the bylaw, but this is the language that
Well,
need to be researched and might take some time to incorporate correctly. Is that
I
right?
think it's in addition to what we've sort of categorized as needs a little bit more staff time and research.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think I agree with the intent being completely appropriate. I think that the building commissioner is going to have a hard time enforcing residential leases, right? I mean, I don't know that we can realistically put that position into that role. So that's why there may be other ways that we can look at to address the concern.
I mean, we did restrict it with the ADU bylaw, but we had to think that through rather carefully also, how that was done. And it was enforced by the building commissioner, as I remember.
Sure, but it was written right into the ADU bylaw.
Yes.
That it had to be a year-round.
Yes.
Or now it's one or the other, basically.
Yeah.
It has to be occupied on a year-round basis. But at the time of the original proposal, the requirement was that both units had to be required on, they were required to be occupied on a year-round basis.
Yes. So I think it can be incorporated into this bylaw, but I think what Ryan and Katie are saying is that language needs to be researched, needs to be added, some staff time needs to be committed to it, town council, and it essentially means that January 23rd, we won't have the final draft. We probably won't have the final draft before us to go forward, but it's an option that the board can choose to take if we so choose. Megan?
If we were to take out this thought, like you were saying before, and address it in an inclusionary bylaw later, we could do that, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
We
Okay.
can do it. I will make a comment when you're.
Yeah, no. The reason that I would be supportive of that is because I don't want to hold up the work that you guys have done. I read through it. It's fantastic, and I think that we should go ahead with it. But also, I firmly believe that we should be looking at density issues as well as short-term rental issues on sort of a town-wide basis, not on a neighborhood basis. I feel like, and some of this comes from my sort of zoning board experience, I guess, but I feel like some of the zoning in town had been done piecemeal and often can create problems. And when you look at it more holistically, it can be a little bit more comprehensive and works a little better. Just my 2 cents.
I think that's an excellent thought, and, I think it is the truth. The zoning we have is old, and there's a lot of building and redevelopment that's been done since the comprehensive plan was passed unanimously. That is according to the old zoning that's in place, and that's not, in conformity with the comprehensive plan, and, we're trying to catch up. So what you're saying is true. The zoning is really old, and, there is a need for global revision, so I think that's good. I just wanted to comment, though, as good a solution as it sounds, there's a little drawback in going forward with this now and then addressing these issues of year-round rentals and affordable and attainable in the inclusionary bylaw, there's a drawback, and that's that, for example, say this is taken to annual town meeting 2023, it passes, then we start working on putting the inclusionary bylaw together, and we need to put that together, bring it to the town. Maybe it passes, maybe it doesn't pass. We may end up with a situation where it's not included, and we've allowed for greater density, and it allows, and we've seen this happen before, where the intention of the bylaw, a property owner or developer can follow the letter of the law, but a much different result can be produced. We could get, 8 gloriously expensive, condominiums all over with, something like that, that someone has bought as investment property and isn't renting them just as a summer rental at very high. It could, I'm assuming it could be done, technically without violating the bylaw, it could be used in that way unless we have some regulatory measures in place that prevent that interpretation of the bylaw. Charlene?
You said exactly what my concern was.
Okay.
Exactly. We don't want to create and afford this opportunity for higher density without having some kind of control.
Yeah.
And, I'll go back to just the intent, indicate what the intent of the bylaw is. The poor building commissioner always is the one who gets, excuse the expression, dumped on when, things don't go as they were intended in the bylaw. But if it is in that purpose and intent to allow more density, require it to be year-round, say that it has to stay in single ownership, that it, cannot be condoed, or however, there are ways of doing that I'm not talking about the inclusionary bylaw, which I agree, that's going to take more work. That needs help from DHCD, that needs help from other entities to figure out that language. But the intent of this right now is that this is for year-round occupancy, period.
Yeah.
But I think without having language like that in there, I absolutely share the same concern that you do. We don't want to open Pandora's box here.
Yeah, and timing is everything.
And timing is
And
everything.
the letter of the law is what matters.
And I agree.
And the property owner, the developer, the letter of the law is what matters. That's what they have to adhere to, and we have no way of enforcing anything else. So,
I will say the zoning board is fairly consistent and good with purpose and intent. So if that is made a piece of it, I think that will be enforced.
yeah, but
Yeah, who is the permit granting authority in this case for these units? Is it the zoning board or is it the planning board? That I could not figure out.
it's probably the zoning board, but
It would-
Katie, please.
I think the intent was that it would be the zoning board of appeals. We do have under the purpose, one of the last bullet under the purpose for the bylaw is to allow more diverse housing types attainable to all residents of all income levels. We could tweak that to say on a
Yeah.
year-round basis, or to add some sort of wording year-round that we can,
Yes.
propose for the next draft.
Yes, but, and also, I believe, however, that the higher density is not by special permit, but it's by right. Isn't that correct, in this bylaw? So it wouldn't go before zoning board of appeals. So
That's
then we-
correct. However,
Yeah.
you still have the opportunity to change your mind that all, multifamily would require a special permit. The only place we were allowing it by right, again, we have the zones, if you recall,
Right,
A,
yes,
A1 and
yes,
A2.
sorry.
And according to the use table, the only place it was, I'm sorry, that would be for the mixed use.
I think they're all special permit,
Are they?
the way I'm reading it, yeah.
For multifamily, they would both be special permit, yes. It
Okay,
wouldn't-
sorry.
And
More
affordable,
here.
all zones are special permit.
Right. However, what we would want to look at is where the mixed-use development, where there was a mix of commercial and residential, those are special condition, and we may want to change them
That-
to special
Because
permit.
you could end up with a Nickerson Corners.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That one would fall underneath, well, just with us then, correct?
Just with the planning board, however, if we could potentially change those to be
Yep.
special permits.
permit,
Yep.
yeah, that would make sense. But we still need to consider, I think, I'd like to ask the board to still consider whether we would feel better if we actually added the language that, specifically restricts to year-round occupancy and so on. Megan?
I just really strongly oppose doing that on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. I would happily include the special permit. I do think that purpose and intent is highly regarded by the zoning board, so especially if you explain when this comes out to the zoning board that that was the purpose and intent in case someone didn't read the whole thing. Not that anyone would do that, but I'm just saying. But I feel like if we start to zone by neighborhood, I don't know, I think it's a slippery slope.
Okay.
Well, I don't think we're talking about zoning by neighborhood, but what we're talking about is zoning for the neighborhood centers which have already been approved by the town, and which different people have different thoughts as to exactly what was envisioned, but I think this board is pretty much in common agreement that we're looking to increase density of long-term housing, and in a way that creates walking areas which are very livable. It's as if you're putting a small little village inside of Chatham as the quid pro quo for rezoning 80% of Route 28 to residential. I think we may be setting a pattern, as a matter of fact, I hope we are, for the zoning that would be for the other neighborhood centers.
Yeah.
I don't think every neighborhood center ought to look totally different from every other, although there can be some special situations that would cause it to be different. But if it's possible to prohibit short-term rentals in the neighborhood center, I think we would be remiss, in my view, for not putting that in the draft and as a proposal. Recognize, too, short-term rental, as I'm hearing about it through the working group on short-term rentals, short-term is 90 days. So if you're going to be okay with people renting things out for 91 days, then, there'll always be a way to play with what's in the law. But however, the issue of short-term rentals appears to be one of, it's less than 90 days.
Yeah.
I think we ought to also cut off right at, before it gets started, the ability to utilize any of the housing in the neighborhood centers as event venues. I think that ought to be precluded in the bylaw because there's some question as to whether you can do that in a regulation. And I don't think we want to get in the middle of, we're creating a bylaw, we don't want it to be event venues, right? And I do think, again, I haven't heard the board agree or disagree with my feeling that we ought to have a minimum density as well as a maximum. And if the answer is you agree, I think the right numbers, having looked at what other towns around are doing, even at 12 per unit per acre, that's significantly less than you could build there. And I like the numbers, minimum of 8, maximum of 12, and 25% of them have to be affordable, attainable. And there's no payment in lieu of building them. You got to build them.
Yes, no, yes.
And you can't rent them out. If we can prohibit short-term rentals in the neighborhood centers, I think that is an extremely desirable thing to do because there will be every effort to make them short-term rentals. Because you can't imagine a better place. And you can walk to the beach, you can walk to the grocery stores, everything you really want, other than a swimming pool, is going to be in the units that are built in a neighborhood center.
Yeah.
So if it's possible to prohibit that, and we're in a favor of that's what ought to be there, I'm in favor of, let's say it, let's do it, put it in the bylaw.
I'd just like to make a couple of comments, and then Ryan. First, I did just want to comment about zoning for the neighborhood center specifically. It is called for in the comprehensive plan that each neighborhood center, that zoning is created for each neighborhood center that is actually idiosyncratic for that particular neighborhood center. And so when the board first started working on this project, and that's really been in response to the visioning study that was done by Cape Cod Commission in 2013 and 2014. Actually, probably the board was working on this project before that, but in response to that, that was the approach that was taken. I think since that time in the process that the board's gone through, we've discovered, for example, when we worked on the design standards with Cape Cod Commission, that actually the same design standards were applicable to all neighborhood centers. And we've kind of come to the conclusion, although we'll pay attention to the particular needs of each neighborhood center, that probably in general we can use the zoning that's created for West Chatham. We can use that for Kroll Road and for the cornfield. Probably it'll be very much the same. But I did just want to comment that that's why we're taking the approach we're taking, is because it is asked for in the comprehensive plan.
And I think I misspoke. I'm really only referring to the zoning
Yes, the
for
inclusionary-
affordable and attainable housing
Yes,
specifically.
okay, yeah. And the only other comment I wanted to make about addressing these issues in the inclusionary bylaw, a possibility to avoid this problem with the timing is something that we considered at one point when we were working with the RPZ zoning, and it was a separate action, that we present both actions at the same town meeting, that the inclusionary bylaw, if it can't be ready for 2023, I know we don't want to wait with West Chatham, but just to avoid that idea that there's a gap where those issues are not regulated, that we present them at the same town meeting, and that if the inclusionary bylaw is not passed, that we pull back on the West Chatham. In other words, we don't allow it to go forward unless there are regulations in place that will disallow using the increased density for something that's not intended by the bylaw. But there is that problem in my mind of having separate actions, is that one could be passed and the other might not be passed, and then you have, an open issue. But Ryan, please comment.
I did just want to comment that, while the need for year-round housing is undeniable, for a vibrant neighborhood community, there are various housing types that play into that. There's seasonal workforce housing units, there are snowbird condominiums, we need to look at all types of housing, so requiring only one, I think could be an unintended consequence. So I think we would need to look at that as staff, and I would just caution against incorporating any sort of short-term rental language, especially if there's a working group that's active right now, into this bylaw at this stage, because I think it would really raise a lot more questions than answers, and be quite controversial throughout the public hearing process. And I think there's a better separate way that we could present ideas to you for how to address those very real issues.
Okay, thank you.
Can I speak, please?
yes.
You always look over there. And
Yes. I should move here and put you. Sorry, Bob.
That's fine. Well, first of all, in terms of waiting, it seems to me as soon as we go public with this, we're going to be changing it and adding to it. That should not be our restriction, that we can't put that language in, because it's going to change. Whatever we do, we're going to be reacting to comments and making changes right up to March at the very least. If you can't get the language in there by then, I think then we could make a decision to pull it. But I don't think that should be our big decision. And secondly, I'm a little concerned about the density in general, because are we talking about 8 to 10 for the entire property, but you could have 40 on one of the acres and none on the, I mean, is it an overall density for the property? Is there a restriction on how clustered that can be? No, so it's just, we're going with 8 to 10, 12.
12, yeah.
Okay, okay, I'm glad that's resolved. I still come back to the idea that the only way we actually get everything we want with the limiting short term is to make them affordable or attainable. And therefore, to me, if we're going to, we could put into this bylaw that you can have 4 or 6, but if you want 12, then the extra 6 have to all be attainable or affordable. That way, we've got both an incentive for them to produce more of the attainable, affordable, and we also now have a restriction, at least on most of the properties in that development, that they would not be allowed to be short-term. So the idea that we're increasing the density in these areas should be because we want people to be there year-round. We want to encourage that, and that's the easiest way to do it. Just say everything above a certain number has to be attainable or affordable, and that sort of serves all these purposes.
Bob, but I think you raised the question as to whether they're ever going to be built then. You know, the affordable attainables are not the profitable ones, and if you can build fewer of them rather than more of them, that's generally my observation as to what's happening. You know, where I came out was minimum 8, maximum 12. If you build the minimum, there's 2 affordable units. If you build the maximum, there's 3 affordable units, and they got to be built. You're assured of that.
That still applies at 6. But if you want to go to 12, and then it goes up to 40% have to be attainable and to get.
Yeah, but then they're not going to build them.
Why?
They'll just
Why?
build the 8. You know,
Just because the
you know,
costs. Sorry. to
the
interrupt.
perfect is the enemy of the good here, I think. I want to see a house, affordable, attainable being built. And I want to see, you know, there's a minimum number that have to be built, and that would be 2. And the maximum would be 3 per acre. If you got a 2-acre lot, well, that's 6 units. And if your incentive to build 12 density is that you get 1 additional, let's call it, not attainable, affordable, that if you decide to build the extra ones.
Okay,
You know, and
I'll back off all of them have to be, but I think as we move up from 4 to 8, that at least has to be proportional in terms of how many of those additional ones have to be affordable or attainable. But I hear what you're saying.
well,
I'm not
if
sure.
we're talking 25%
I'm not
versus
sure that
30,
it's-
well, you know, I just like the round numbers of it. For, you know, at 8 and 25%, I can do the arithmetic, you know, and if it's 12 at 25%, I can do that too. And we get more affordable units, and there's an incentive because you get more non-affordable units if you build more and increase to the maximum density. But I'm also equally of the feeling it's extremely important that we have a minimum density. Otherwise, we're going to end up with very few housing units being built, and therefore, by definition, even fewer attainable, affordable. So I'm more focused on you got to build 8 units per
Yeah,
unit,
well,
you know,
As
per
a minimum.
acre.
You're saying
And
8 should be
okay,
the minimum.
25% of them ought to be attainable, affordable. And if that's what we think ought to happen, we ought to say so, all in one place at one time, in one bylaw, in one draft, and it'll, as you say, it'll get changed, tweaked by by town council, by whomever, when it finally comes out. But at least we will have put forward something that we think holds together, you know, as we put it forward, and has the maximum probability of achieving our desired outcome. We'll have to wait 25 years to see if that happens, but at least for the moment anyway, the first development that comes along might be fairly soon, And hopefully, it might look something like we're trying to create an incentive for. And I do think that it's a terrific idea for to prohibit short-term rentals in the neighborhood centers. I really do. If we can do that, if you can do it at all, it'll be through a bylaw, I assume, as opposed to a regulation. As I say, it's one of my concerns about the short-term rental committee. That is, we've decided we want to pretty much use a regulation because you can do that in a hurry, right? But there's a concern that I have that's growing, and that is the issue of using short-term rentals as event venues. So, and that's something that might require a bylaw.
So how do we define
And if we put
an
it in our
event?
bylaw, that's good,
I
it's in
think
there.
Charlotte,
How do we define what an event venue is to ban it?
Well, what you're really talking about is rentals that are not by the owner for events. There are the bylaw examples around which go, with a for example kind of thing for, large weddings, alumni reunions, family reunions, and so on and so on. Not the owner. The owner is not restricted in any way from doing those things. It's when there's somebody else in the middle, it's a company that buys up or rents year-round and then sublets, maximizing the number of rentals, short-term, for events.
if I could jump in, or Ryan, if you'd
Yeah,
like to do.
I would just encourage that the short-term rental conversation be separate from your work on this bylaw, especially at this late stage in your efforts. And we can bring to you what some of the other communities have done relative to short-term rentals. There's health regulations, there's nuisance regulations, there's minimum number of stay, and we can present that if the board is interested, or to the short-term committee. I'd be happy to make myself available to
No.
them with some ideas.
I
but-
think the restrictions that are being talked about by the committee, that's true, but I think where I come out for the zoning bylaw for the neighborhood centers is, we don't want short-term rentals.
could
So
I
can we
ask-
prohibit it?
Could I ask through the chair, perhaps maybe to take a poll of the board just for staff's direction purposes about the minimum and maximum density language as you've suggested, and whether short-term rental, we should explore including that here, just so we can come back to you on the 23rd with some clear language that reflects your consensus today.
Yeah, I just want to, yes, okay. I think the larger question is that we also want to pull the board is just the general question of how best to address the issues of regulating the actual application of the greater density. Do we want to regulate it in this bylaw, or do we want to regulate it in a separate action, if that's the inclusionary bylaw? And if so, how do we mitigate the hazard, basically the hazard that, suppose the Chatham zoning is passed and the inclusionary bylaw is still being formulated, it does mean that that bylaw is in place that allows greater density without additional regulations in place to restrict, the application of that bylaw for things that are not intended, So, but maybe I've made it too complicated.
No, I
Maybe we
think-
should poll each a separate question.
Whatever your pleasure.
So the question I want to ask, and I think we do need the advice of staff, what is the best way technically to address the issue of attainable, affordable, of not using the greater density for purposes that we don't intend? In other words, not for year-round occupancy, and also to have at least some of the units used for attainable or affordable. I agree with Ryan that our purpose is to create a diversity of housing options in the neighborhood centers. I don't know that we want to do only affordable, attainable housing in the neighborhood centers, but we don't want, the result that we don't want is, for example, using the greater density that's allowed for very expensive condominiums or townhouses that are used as vacation rentals by, even by non-residents, by corporate owners who've used it as investment properties. That's what we don't want, the greater density. That's not the intention of the greater density, that's what I should say. So I'm trying to formulate how best to ask the board this question. I would ask staff, I would want to ask staff, what is the very best, the optimal way of putting those regulations in place? And then I think we should pursue how to, if the optimal way is not to include them in the West Chatham zoning bylaw, but to address them in an inclusionary bylaw, I would propose that we put both of those forth at the same annual town meeting so that we don't end up with a gap in coverage, so to speak. But I need to hear from you what you would feel would be optimal. Or is it better to incorporate the language here and then later also do an inclusionary bylaw?
So I think the latter. I think what you have here just needs that little bit of additional clarity on the minimum and the maximum density. There is a provision for affordable units at greater densities, right? I think what you have here works very well. There was some discussion at the last meeting about, further inclusionary percentages, et cetera, and that's where we sort of spiraled out, I think, a little bit, and I think we may have gotten off track. What you have here, I think, is solid. In terms of ensuring that the market rate units are year-round, perhaps we can look at what the ADU bylaw did as a model and suggest some language at the next meeting when we give you the final drafts. We can talk about that. But I don't think that you need an inclusionary zoning ordinance in place to make this zoning bylaw workable,
Okay.
right? I think that's an and in the future.
Okay.
One more task that we need to ensure that affordability is a part of our development in Chatham, but
Okay.
doesn't necessarily have to limit this moving forward, would be my recommendation.
So in other words, by the next meeting, you feel that you could add language that would restrict the added density to year-round occupancy or rentals and would prohibit short-term rentals?
I think short-term rentals, I would suggest, sorry, Warren, I think that should not be here.
It's a separate discussion.
I think it's a separate discussion that will invite a lot of confusion from the public about what your real intent is here and the work that you've done to date.
I totally agree, and I actually agree with you completely. I just think if we conflate the issues, this will never pass because short-term rentals is so political
Yeah,
that I think that it's going to sort of cut off your nose to spite your face.
that's a good expression.
Well, I did my markups here assuming that we couldn't prohibit short-term rentals. So I'm only hearing that maybe you could. I think that's what the board would like to have happen. And short-term rentals almost is a defined term, the way it's being talked about, and there's a whole scope of
Yeah.
issues that come up, and I agree, we don't want to get into all of that. All I'm saying is, if you can somehow keep any units being built in the neighborhood centers from being rented out for short periods of time, then we ought to include it in our bylaw.
And
And
maybe
I
that,
don't know, and maybe you can say rentals need to be for a minimum of a year.
maybe we can import some of the language that was vetted for the ADU bylaw
Sure.
into this bylaw.
Yeah,
Would that solve this issue?
I think we would certainly want to run that language by town council, but
Yeah.
I made some notes here and something along the lines of that, these properties should not be occupied for less than
12 months, yeah.
91 days or something along those lines, maybe not specifically saying short-term rental, but it allows for seasonal workers to be there. It allows for people to be there, again, snowbirds or other people that may be, there on a part-time basis, but it might be their dwelling unit. But again, the deed restrictions would go into effect for the affordable
And the attainable.
and the
yeah.
attainable.
Which would be
Once
only
we're-
some of the units, not all of them.
Madam Chairman, I also think that it's something that we should consider, and that is that perhaps we have incorporated in this a mandatory look back after X years. So 5 years, 6 years, 7 years.
How it's performing.
Down the road, there'd be a mandatory look back, and you can sort of fix it. And everybody knows that's the time to try and make corrections and see what has happened in the meantime. It's going to take a while before you know whether you got it right or not.
Arthur,
Yeah. Well, I think we shouldn't brush over what Megan had brought up. If we get this too messy
Right.
associated with anything on this density and housing piece, this is not going to go anyplace. I've been through this experience in my previous town when I was on the board there and we rezoned for the town center. The success of a neighborhood center is what we learned was not just all the businesses and everything that you have here for uses, it was that residential component. If you don't have that right, what happens is that is a mechanism for developers to fund their ability to do all the rest. So we have to be very careful here, in my opinion, we have to be very careful here about not confusing and messing this residential piece up. I agree with what Megan was saying is let's deal with, and also you, Ryan, let's deal with the 8 and the 12. Let's put as much information as we can in there to put some guidelines associated with it. The reason why I went with the 8 and 12 is it was a surprise to me is we had something similar to that in our previous town. It went over very successfully. The residential made the town center work. It really did. It created that livelihood of people who were there. And if you don't have people there, then you roll up the sidewalks at 5 o'clock, and that doesn't work in a neighborhood center. So, and then surprise to me, toward the end of my stay in my town, they were looking at raising the density even beyond that because they felt it could handle, the town center can handle it, and it would even liven up the town, that center even more. So I think that could be a possibility later on if this is all works out well. Now, I'm not encouraging that. I'm not saying that that's where we're going, but don't be surprised. But you need to have a sufficient amount in here to make the whole thing work. That's been my experience on this. So that's the way I'd like to go. I think, Ryan, with you and Megan are saying, I think that's the direction that we should head in. I would still like to go ahead with this for the Maytown meeting. I think anything associated with all the points that Warren said are not going to be solved by this. And I don't think we should, because as soon as we get into that avenue and we go down that pathway, everything focuses there, and
Yeah.
lose sight of what we're trying to do in here. I think we have a good model here. I agree with you, Catherine, that this is a model that we wanted to do at the other neighborhood centers, and I think we could do them year after year after year.
Right.
And I would like to get there. And so as much as we could to move this forward and flush it out during the hearings with some of the public in that and do the refinements like we did with the ADU, I'm all for it.
okay. I think Charlene would like to speak.
Speaking to public hearing and time, what is the drop dead date to get this to the Board of Selectmen for inclusion on the annual town meeting warrant?
So we would be looking to the board to make a recommendation at your January 23rd meeting. So we would have to have a draft with all of the amendments and revisions discussed to date before you in order to ask you to do that.
Yes.
One of the suggestions that I'm going to make, only because of my past experience, is that, we can do that certainly on the 23rd. Once you hold the public hearing, you may not be able to make some of the changes that you want to make because it may go beyond the scope of the bylaw, and you don't want to be making changes on the floor of town meeting. That is very messy. Very messy. So a path that I have seen done in other communities is that you hold some public meetings before you hold that actual final public hearing. So you can kind of
Yeah.
mold it, create it the way that you want it to get to the town meeting.
Yeah, that's generally been our practice in Chatham. We usually have a number of community listening sessions or community forums before we vote on a draft draft to be sent to the select board. In
Here's
this-
my concern, however, that if we need to have something to them by January 23rd, or vote to have it go to them on the 23rd, I don't know how much tweaking that can be done from that draft to what actually appears in the town meeting warrant.
There's been a considerable amount of public outreach to date on this zoning bylaw, so this isn't the first time the public is seeing it.
Yeah.
So your recommendation on whatever the final tweaks that we are making have been in full public discussion for
Years.
years.
Years. and-
But we haven't seen that draft. I haven't seen that draft.
Right, so one of the challenges we discussed is that there's 2 new members to bring up to speed, and whether that is, a factor of concern in moving forward to Maytown meeting.
Yeah.
I don't want it to hold up going to Maytown meeting, but I want to be sure that whatever language we finally do end up with will need as little or no changes on the floor of town meeting, because that can kill.
Well,
I don't think we're looking at changes on the town of.
I have a very
the
different
floor of town
perspective here.
meeting. Yeah, sorry.
We haven't even mentioned the elephant in the room, which is the runway protection zone. We have 30% of the town that's going to be against this just because it's got the word runway in it. So.
And the other 30% for the affordable.
So I just think this is going to be a very difficult thing to get a 2/3 majority for. And trying to rush it through without all the considerations that we're going to have to go through, I'm willing to try it, but I really am not very optimistic that we're going to be successful in that. Just because of the runway issue
Yes.
being involved here.
Yes, Ryan.
So it's my understanding that so much of the language that's in this working draft has been in place since prior to the RPZ issue coming up.
Yes.
The work that you've done
Yes.
really over the past year has been to address that issue, and you've
Yes.
gotten some good consensus and language from council about how to do that. So we're just sort of re-educating the public as part of this public hearing process about something that's been vetted many times over.
I think, yes, it has been vetted many
Well,
times.
that's
over.
very true, but, Bob is absolutely correct. All the negative comments from and about the RPZ are not going to go away. People are not going to have been convinced. And that issue is going to remain there all the way up to and including and through the town meeting. That's on top of the general resistance there is ever to approve a zoning bylaw.
Yeah.
Can
Yes,
I
go
make a
ahead. Yes,
suggestion?
please do.
So give me a chance to bring a revised final document to you at your next meeting with a timeline of all the public outreach and engagement that has occurred to date on this. And decide at that point if you're ready to make a recommendation or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, and the public, if I may comment, the public outreach goes back to at least 2013. So-
Before I was here the first time.
Yes. So there's been a lot of it. I think that's a good suggestion. And do you think also that between now and January 23rd, that incorporating some of the language that we used in the ADU to restrict at least some of the greater density to year-round use, that could also be accomplished?
I'd like to talk with Katie about that and have a recommendation to you
On the 23rd.
on the 23rd.
Yeah.
Yes,
I think we
Kate.
would have to explore what options we have available, and we can certainly present that to the board within the draft, or at least with an explanation on the 23rd.
Yeah, okay, good.
Also, I'm not sure where we stand with respect to my feeling that we should prohibit payments in lieu of building the affordable units. Because I would certainly want to see that in there, to see that Not that they're able to be built, but that they will be built.
If there isn't a provision for them, then it's not allowed. Sorry.
There's no provision in the draft which
Provision for a
indicates that
payment in lieu,
payment in
which
lieu
means
of
it's not
is
an
permitted.
option.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
that's as I understood it, yes, that's, yes. So, so the proposal that's before the board from Ryan and Katie is that a proposed final draft will be presented to the board at the January 23rd meeting, and at that point, we'll review it, and we will decide whether we feel comfortable bringing it forward and moving forward with the process to bring it to annual town meeting 2023. So I see the heads nodding, so if I were to poll the board to get a sense of the board, can everyone say, yes, you agree that that's a reasonable and acceptable course of action? Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Agree.
Yes, okay, great. All right, so so I think that's our course of action. Great. Good. Any other discussion or points about this? I think we've had a good discussion and resolved the issues well, and we'll review everything again on the 23rd. If there's no other
Chairman,
points.
just
yes.
one comment. The draft which we were talking about this evening does not yet have in it
Correct.
all of the new territory that we are including in the neighborhood center. And I
Correct.
think that we ought to have that in front of us such that it's part of whatever it is we thumbs up or thumbs
Yeah.
down.
Yes, the boundaries, yes, that'll also be included. Correct.
Yeah, so the text of a draft bylaw can be before you. Some of the graphics may be in a compendium until we have full working capability to modify those. But the language in Word can certainly be.
And the boundaries would be a separate, usually we do that as a separate action, so it would be a separate bylaw,
So
proposed
zoning,
bylaw.
3 articles is what we discussed, a map amendment, the neighborhood center bylaw, and a potential table of use regulations, so 3 articles.
Yeah, okay, good. Yes, Katie, did you want to make a comment, or, no?
I've given Katie a heart attack, I
If
think,
there's,
tonight.
if there's no other,
Just a question.
yes,
I'm always concerned doing it as 3 separate articles, only because if one doesn't pass and 2 do, you're kind of stuck. I've seen it done where there's 3 parts to 1 article.
I think we'll have to defer to council. The practice I've seen it is a bit mixed, but it varies by town, so we'd want to get council to weigh in about how
Okay.
to structure it.
Yeah.
But I agree, you have to pull if one doesn't, and that's where it
Exactly, and
gets
that
tricky.
is just disheartening if and when that happens. I've
A
been
lot
there,
of
done
effort
that.
wasted.
when we've addressed the neighborhood centers in Chatham before, when we did South Chatham, we had 2 articles, one for the zoning for the South Chatham Neighborhood Center and one for the boundaries. And the reason we did that, I think, is because we didn't want one to be held up by issues that pertain to the other. So,
But if you don't have the boundaries, then how does the bylaw work?
right,
It's,
The
Yes.
bylaw first, then
yeah,
yeah.
you know, the cart before the horse or the horse,
Yes, Arthur.
What I've seen is that the boundaries is generally separate because that could get modified later on without affecting everything else. But I do agree with Charlene's
Yeah.
point about, especially the use piece, is make that
That should be one.
make that a 2-parter as far as one warrant article. Yeah. I'd be okay doing everything all at one, but I don't have any problem with at least those 2 pieces going together.
Yeah, yes, and we have, I think, the use table and the zoning should be one action, at least, yeah, I would agree. Did you have a comment, Katie, or?
So just for the meeting on the 23rd, again, we've been starting at 4 PM. I believe we have 1 site plan approval and
one bond.
one bond
Release.
reduction or bond release. Is the board okay doing regular business first, again, to get that out of the way, and then we can move on with long-range planning? So
Yeah.
the same as today's agenda will work.
We'll start at 4 o'clock.
We'll start
yeah.
at 4 o'clock.
And
Okay.
also, I'll just ask again if there's any more board comments, and then we will take public comment.
Yeah, are we resolved on what we're doing with the airport commission?
We haven't addressed that issue. I think the only question in my mind, and I think, again, we might want to decide this on January 23rd, is whether we wanted to review the language in a joint meeting with the Airport Commission or simply forward to them what we propose and then get their comments. And that would be best done after January 23rd when we've approved the final, possibly approved the final draft. So, yes. So we could get a sense of the board now. I'm getting a sense that the board would like to just send our draft proposed, send it to the Airport Commission and ask for their comments. Am I correct in
I concur.
understanding? Okay. And I'm seeing Bob
Absolutely.
Dubus is okay, Warren's okay, Arthur.
Well,
And
the
Bob
only
or
thing is that
Shafter.
if we're going to have, if we had a discussion before, and obviously we don't have time, that we would resolve some of the issues or hear the issues. All the public, including the Airport Commission, is going to have comments. To not get those before we go formal seems a little backwards, and we're rushing this in that way because we've never actually had a conversation with the Airport Commission on this one. So I think the plan we have is okay. I mean, we're going to do it, and I just think that we're likely to have more comments and changes than can be accommodated, and we're just going to have to accept that. But let's take a stab at it, and to send it out on the 23rd, and see if we get lucky.
Well, let me ask this, and I'm going to ask Ryan and Katie to weigh in. The board has agreed to the revised wording for the footnotes that pertain to the RPZ. That will be footnotes in the use table in both West Chatham and in the general zoning bylaw. And since the board has already agreed to that, could we forward those just the language of the footnotes to the Airport Commission now? And we might receive their response by the January 23rd meeting.
Well, we could ask for their response by then. So
Yeah.
we would have their input.
So that would be the question I ask, and how does that encumber you or disencumber you?
So, Madam Chair, again, we could potentially do that. I don't know if they're planning to meet before then, and I
Okay.
think that would be difficult to require them to respond to us by the 23rd. I do think it would be beneficial to have them view this in the overall context of the entire
Yes.
bylaw.
Yes.
Rather than just looking at the footnotes. I think that, from the perspective of being fair, I think seeing it in the overall context would be best for them
Okay,
to do.
great, yes, I actually agree with that. I think that is a better approach. So I think the approach we're taking is staff will try to put together the final draft for us. We will look at it at the 23rd, and at that point, we will decide if we're ready to go forward for annual town meeting 2023. And if not, if it needs, if we feel it needs more time, we'll do, we have that option to take more time. Okay, great. So now, let's open it up to comments from the public, and I apologize for the delay. Is there anyone from the public who'd like to make a comment about our discussion tonight on the West Chatham Neighborhood Center proposed draft zoning bylaw? I don't see any hands raised on the internet. Mr. Shell, I don't, you're not exactly the public. This is, but we welcome your comments.
Mike Schell. I am a member of the Select Board, but I'm standing here speaking at the most as the liaison to both your committee, your board, and the Airport Commission. And I just have, first of all, I want to say I have been just blown away by what a phenomenal effort you have made in putting all of this together. And I, speaking not as a Select Board member and in no way prejudicing what I will have to say or think when it comes before us, I just want to commend the discussion and the collaboration and collegiality, staff contribution, everything. I'm so impressed. And I guess I'll just add one comment. I think it was Warren that said, or somebody said, the perfect is the enemy of the good. That's so
It's
true here.
Yeah.
I do want to make one sort of technical suggestion with respect to your submission of this, when you do it, whenever, to the Airport Commission. And that is, I think it would be so helpful if either one of you, with the background of all of the discussion and how you got where you got, offers to be available at their meeting when they consider the footnotes, to respond to questions, explain whatever, rather than sitting and waiting for a bunch of stuff to come back, which then takes more time. So, or with legal counsel, I'll
Yeah,
leave that
maybe
to
with
you,
town
but that's the one
council or-
technical suggestion I would make.
Yeah.
So, thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Or possibly community, Katie or Gloria or Ryan or town council. But maybe we can think of the best combination of, okay. That's a good suggestion. Thank you, Mike. Okay. Again, any comments from the public? I don't see any hands raised. Katie or Ryan, do you see any hands raised? Well, it might be time for Mr. Dubus. Would you like to make a motion?
I would gladly.
Up down there.
I'll beat him. I move that we adjourn the meeting on January 9th.
You're not allowed to do that.
Warren Chain, I second the motion.
Okay. Bob Wertschafter.
Approved.
Art Spru.
Art Sprue, approve.
Warren Chain.
Warren Chain, approved.
Megan Story.
Story approved.
Charlene.
Charlene Greenhalgh approved.
Bob Dubus.
Well, I don't know if I can approve this or not. But I approve.
And this is Catherine Halpern. I also approve that we adjourn the meeting at this time. Let's note the time. It looks like 5:59. And again, thank you, everybody, for your participation, and enjoy the rest of the evening.